Hey, everybody. Are there any sociologists here? Well, hi. Here's one, yay. So I'm here to talk to you about culture, which is my specialty area, and which we don't often talk about too much when we're preparing you for jobs. And so I want to both explain about the importance of culture, but also why it's important from a sociological perspective, why we understand theoretically that it's something that you also need to pay attention to when you're out in the job market and in the workplace. So we talk about different kinds of capital, right? For those of you in business, if you're thinking about capital, you may be thinking about financial capital, right? So where's the money? We also talk about human capital. And human capital is about what you know, what kinds of skills you have, what kind of disciplinary background you have. So whether you're an engineer or a sociologist or a historian, you come into the world with this set of knowledge and skills that counts as your human capital and that can make you very valuable to an employer. We also have social capital, which you probably hear about every time we tell you the importance of networking and doing elevator speeches and handing out your business card, right? Social capital is sort of about who you know, if you want to distill it to the most basic form. So the need to know lots of people, to be able to network with people, to enhance your connections, because most jobs are found through what we call loose ties, so people who aren't your best friends, but people who you know through some kind of a network. So this is always also important. But another kind of capital that's important is cultural capital. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the background of where this term came from and what it means to us as sociologists, and then move into talking about some recent studies that have shown how this is pertinent to the workplace and to the job hunt, which is more immediately salient to you guys. So cultural capital, this term was developed by Pierre Bourdieu, who was a French sociologist, and he talked about the different kinds of capital, but he also focused in on this concept of cultural capital. And the idea with cultural capital is that you are born into a family that is part of a culture that has a culture that is often informed by socioeconomic status, and in which you end up learning stuff kind of by osmosis as you're growing up, right? It's not that your parents sit you down and teach you stuff, but you just kind of absorb it as you're going along. And this kind of capital, can include things like dispositions, how you approach the world. It can include tastes. So what do you enjoy? What do you like doing? What are your hobbies? And what are the kinds of things that people within the circles that your parents run in do for fun, for enjoyment? What do they appreciate? And also things like manners. How do you talk to each other? What kind of language do you use? This is the kind of thing you're hearing, when you go to one of the sessions on how to dress for success, right? How to go through an interview process and learning how you're supposed to act, right? So the thing is that when you have cultural capital, and we're talking about this, it also serves to separate people and to create distinctions. And it can distinguish us often by class. And so it ends up being a way that people signal whether they're part of the group or not part of the group. Unintentionally, because again, we're growing up with this, we're getting this stuff by osmosis, or we're not getting it because we're not in that culture. But then when you find yourself in a position where you're interacting with people of the dominant culture, you can end up not being able to fit in quite right because the things they value are different than what you might have learned growing up, or the things they value are the same that you learned as you were growing up because you're from that similar class. So when Bourdieu did his research, he was focused on France, and he was focused on thinking about cultural capital in terms of how you can actually use capital to get ahead. So when he would analyze his data and look at people who were able to succeed both financially and in terms of status, he saw correlations between familiarity with what he terms high culture. And so in France, high culture was the stuff you'd think of like opera and ballet and classical music, these kinds of rarefied forms of culture that require a certain amount of appreciation, a certain amount of knowledge, But he was noticing that when people grew up surrounded by these kinds of cultural experiences and knowing what those cultural experiences were going to be like, being able to understand them, being able to go to them and act the way people expected you to act at them, being able to talk about them with some kind of fluency, that this actually ended up being able to recreate inequalities because the people who were talking about this stuff were all from similar classes. They all were able to hang out together, whether at the opera house or the country club, and they knew this sort of set of codes, right? Codes and symbols that they were able to enact to maintain their position in society and also to maintain distinctions between themselves and other classes or other groups of people. So one of the questions comes up is, well, how does this work? Like, how do you translate culture into status and money? And it's an indirect kind of relationship, whereby if you have cultural capital, if you have familiarity with the symbols and the knowledges and the cultural forms that are held in highest esteem in your society, then that can increase your social capital and it can increase your human capital. So how does that work? So you've got high culture capital. You're in France in the 60s, and you know about ballet, and you know about opera, and you know about all of these, fascinating high art forms. You're able to interact with these people who also like these forms very easily, right? You can have conversations with them about it. You can go to a performance with them and understand it. You can signal that, yeah, this is stuff I know about too. And because the people who tend to know about these things are the people who are in the privileged dominant classes, you end up being able to make connections, right? And you're making connections with people who are in these privileged dominant classes, which may be able to open doors for you to either stay within that class if that's where you came from, or to join that class if you didn't come from there. So that's the social capital. Human capital, it also affects education quite a bit, because we see that people with higher levels of cultural capital, whatever is valued in that particular society as culture, ends up being valued in ways that help determine whether people get into university, for instance, and whether they're able to stay in university. And by staying in university, you gain more human capital, right? You gain more skills, you gain more knowledge. There's all kinds of reasons that this can happen. So one study looked at education on the most basic levels at primary school. And what they found was that the people who were upper middle class, parents who were upper middle class, sort of understood the culture of the school and the culture of the teachers. And so if their kid was faltering, they would feel empowered to go down to the school and say, hey, my kid's having trouble. Can you help me? What does he need to do? We need extra support. We need to change his classroom. We need to figure out a tutor for him. Whereas the people who were from working class backgrounds didn't feel that same kind of empowerment, and in fact thought it would be inappropriate for them to go down and do this, thought it wouldn't be accepted. And so they stayed out of it. They saw teachers as, you're the ones who have the control, you do what you need to do, and we're not supposed to come down and talk to you, right? That would be insulting to you, that would be getting in your face about something we know nothing about. So because there are these class differences, the students who are in the upper middle classes, who are in the dominant classes, end up getting different kinds of advantages because they have parents coming in to advocate for them in ways that the working class parents didn't feel comfortable doing or didn't have the cultural knowledge to even know this was an option. So having cultural capital ends up affecting the education that people can get. Once you have human capital and social capital together, it becomes much easier to gain financial status, and to gain financial success and to gain social status, right? And so we see that having cultural capital ends up influencing these two other mechanisms, which then end up increasing your chances of being in a higher class, in a higher income bracket, in a higher status kind of position in society. So one of the big questions that came up about cultural capital, because when Bourdieu wrote about it, it was like, you got it or you don't, right? You're born into a family that has cultural capital, that's in the dominant class, or you're not, right? This is my new great niece, by the way. Isn't she adorable? I haven't gotten to meet her yet in person. We're going down to North Carolina this summer. But so Olivia has been born into a family that's upper middle class. Her father is a lawyer. Her mother has a master's in public administration and works in a professional position. They're comfortable financially. They both went to university and grad school and law school. So she's going to be growing up with a lot of this cultural capital stuff, right? And originally Bourdieu sort of came out saying, yeah, that's it. You have it or you don't, because it's so ingrained and feels so natural. It's just there from birth or it isn't. But fortunately, other researchers came around and complicated this idea and pointed out that no, in fact, if you're not born with cultural capital, you can still acquire it. It's not too late. So one study that I like to talk about is a study by Robert Granfield. And he studied working class students who went to an elite law school. Okay, so students who came from backgrounds where typically their parents had not gone to university, had certainly not gone to graduate school, had come from working class origins, and had done well in university, and then had gone on to law school at an elite university, not a state school, not a lower tier, but like the top of the top. As a result, because they're in this top tier law school, they're surrounded by people who are in the upper classes, right? They're surrounded by people who had all the cultural capital coming in, who had financial support, who had educational support. So they get there, they get to campus, and it turns out it's a culture shock, right? And why is this a culture shock? Because so many of their peers grew up in a culture where being in law school was just natural to them, right? All of the things that you need to know to succeed and move in those circles were natural to them because they saw their parents doing it, they saw their parents' friends doing it. It was just, like the water that you drink and the air that you breathe growing up. And so they found things like they'd be sitting in a classroom and a professor would be talking about financial investments. And he would say, of course, you all know about this because you're familiar with your parents' financial investments, right? And these working class students are sitting there going like, what investments you're talking about? We have no idea what you're talking about, right? Things like how they dressed. They're walking around campus and they start noticing that other people, the majority of people on campus are dressed in a particular way that is not the way they're dressed. So they're trying to figure out, okay, how do I need to dress? Ways of talking to people and interacting with each other. Again, trying to figure out how do I shift this focus. So he called his article, Making It by Faking It. Because what he found was that these students were feeling out of place. He went and he went and interviewed these students and did participant observation, hung out with them on campus to see what was going on. And so he was able to see that they were definitely feeling uncomfortable. They were definitely aware that their class background was very different than their colleagues and that it was setting them apart in ways that were not particularly comfortable. And they knew they needed to figure out how to overcome this. And so the strategy that many of them used was this idea of making it by faking it. So they didn't quite, the culture wasn't as natural to them, right? They didn't necessarily have the understandings and the symbols that all these peers did. And so they would watch and observe and fake it so until it became feeling more natural. Okay? So one example of how people actually can gain cultural capital, even if they don't come from it originally. Another question that comes up is it universal? So I've been talking about high culture because that's what Bourdieu started out with. So this idea of opera and music and dance, but in fact it's not universal, okay? So what we find is that cultural capital can vary depending on where you are in the world. So depending on what country you're in, depending on what community you're in. It can vary by time period. So what counts as cultural capital in one era doesn't necessarily count later on. So one example of this is research by Kim in 2015. And she was studying educational patterns in Korea. And one of the things that she learned was that cultural capital, one aspect of cultural capital in Korea is the ability to have a degree, a university degree, but not any university degree, one from the United States. And so she found that this presence of a United States degree ended up creating this kind of halo effect ended up creating this cultural capital where people in Korea disproportionately valued US education. And so if you were able to go and get a US education and come back with a US degree, you attained a certain status in society and doors would open to you that wouldn't open to you if you had a degree that was within Korea. I see people nodding. Yeah. So you see that, geography matters. If you're in the US, a US degree is pretty commonplace. Most people in the US, when they get degrees from the US. So that's not as much of a distinctive marker, especially as education levels continue to increase. But you go to another country who really values US education, boom, you've got cultural capital in a different sense. So a study that brings these two concepts together a little bit, the idea that geography matters, place matters, and the idea that you can change and acquire cultural capital even later on, is a study that was done on former prisoners who were preparing to re-enter society and re-enter the workforce. And so what Halushka found was that she identifies cultural capital as being, there's cultural capital, but then there's also non-dominant cultural capital. So the idea that cultural capital, again, is different depending on where you are. The cultural capital that'll give you status in prison is different than what's going to give you status in the job hunt, right? And so part of what they were doing in these workshops to help train people to go back into society was helping them learn a term we call code switching. Anybody familiar with code switching? I see some nods, yeah. So the idea that we are all part of multiple cultures, right? We come in with multiple cultural identities, we operate in different kinds of communities, and sometimes the symbols that are potent in one community and powerful don't translate, right? And so she's trying to teach them how to switch from relying on the cultural codes that are useful in prison settings, which are actually harmful in, say, job hunting settings, and teaching them how to switch back and forth between these codes. And so this can have everything to do from what you wear, right? That what you wear in prison is very different than what you wear on a job interview. That when you look at how you speak to interviewers, you might use different language. You might avoid certain words. And so she is both acknowledging that culture is different in different settings and that you can acquire culture, right? If you don't have it to begin with, you can still learn it. And you can still learn to operate within these settings through code switching, through faking it till you make it, and all that is possible. So this ties into another metaphor that I really like by Ann Swidler, which is called the Cultural Toolkit. And so Ann came up with this idea that culture, instead of thinking about culture as something that we're just born with and stuck with, and is just there, which, to some extent it is. Culture is all this stuff that we just take for granted and don't even think about. It just feels natural. But she argued that, in fact, we use culture. Like, we actively use cultural elements to take action, right? To make connections. We use it. And so she thinks of culture as a toolkit. And so you can imagine yourself walking around with this toolkit, and maybe you've got your tools in there that are useful for you to navigate prison life. And maybe you've got these tools in there that are useful for you to navigate whatever culture your family comes from, that if it happens to be different from the dominant culture. And then you've got some cultural tools from the dominant culture, because it's dominant and we have to figure out how to, navigate within this. And so depending on the setting that we're in, we pull out the appropriate cultural tools and we use them. And so that could be pulling out a cultural tool during a job interview to signal that, oh yes, I too understand the ways of high-powered investment bankers and your culture, right? Or it could be pulling out a tool when you walk into some kind of other organization and you recognize people who are from your subculture within a community, and you're able to connect with them because you're pulling out a different kind of cultural tool. So Rivera has come out with a really great study with a crazy amount of data collection. And so she went out, she decided she was going to study the most kind of stereotypically elite workplaces. Because a lot of work on cultural capital have been done more with working class, middle class kinds of settings. And so she set out and said, no, I'm going to go to like the elite of the elite. I'm going to go and I'm going to study elite law firms, investment banks, and management consulting firms. These kinds of companies that are really competitive to get into and have a lot of financial awards and come with a lot of social status. And so she went out and she did 120 interviews with people who were responsible for hiring at a variety of different organizations that fell into these 3 categories of workplaces. And then she spent 9 months doing participant observation. So she managed to get herself in the door, to have permission to hang out at one of these management firms, work for them kind of as an intern, and be able to observe internally what goes on and how decisions get made in the hiring process. She was all focused on the hiring process. So she wanted to understand what's really going on there, and are they really looking at skill match? Are they really looking at GPAs? What are they looking at? And what she found was that culture matters, and culture matters a lot for these firms in particular. So what she found was that when people were doing interviews, she'd talk to them later about their interviews. And in some cases, she came up with sets of fictitious resumes. And she'd go in and she'd say, okay, look at these resumes. Which of these people would you be most likely to hire and why? And she found that, sure, they were looking to make sure there was a skill match, but even more so, there was a looking to see if there was a cultural match. And this is just a perceived cultural match, right? Because you're in an interview that lasts an hour, right? Or you're sending in your resume and somebody's looking at it for a few minutes, deciding whether to invite you in for the interview that lasts an hour. And they talk about culture in different ways. So one was the idea that they were looking for a cultural match with the culture of their firm. And the idea that we want people to fit in, we want people to have similar interests, we want people to have similar passions, and they would identify firms as having different personalities. So she would talk to somebody in a law firm, and they'd say, well, this guy, in his resume, he's got all this extracurricular stuff that's like he plays lacrosse, and he plays baseball, and he likes all this sports stuff. He's really sporty. We're not really a sporty firm, we're more of a nerdy firm. Like our people, they like to play video games and they watch Star Wars and they read a lot. And so we don't think he'd fit in here. He'd fit in better with this other firm we know across town because they're all really sporty. They're all into sports. And that could be enough to get somebody disqualified from a position because they didn't see the fit with the culture. So why does that matter, right? Part of why, I mean, obviously, it's clear why that matters to you who are in the job searching seat. Why does it matter to them? Some people would say, well, we work really long hours at these kinds of jobs. We're there all the time. We're always in overtime. And if I'm going to be sitting across a desk for 16 hours with somebody working on a legal brief, I want to make sure they're people I have something in common with other than what we work, other than the work that we share, right? Other times it was about, we just want people who will fit in so that we'll have a really coherent group and we'll all be able to work together as a team more effectively. But they also looked for culture as in terms of cultural matching. And so she found that if an interviewer sensed that there was a cultural match between their interests and the interviewee, they would evaluate them more positively. And they would be doing this by using a proxy for fit. So they would be saying, well, this person has all of these qualities which I also have, and I fit in well here, so therefore this person will fit in well here, right? So they're looking for similarities. They're looking to see that you like the same, whether it's you like going to the ballet or you like playing squash, they're just looking for the similarities. One guy did actually say, anyone who plays squash, I like. He looked at someone's resume. So this also points to the concept, as we evolved with the study of cultural capital, of cultural omnivores. So I said that cultural capital can vary depending on what time period we're in. So whereas in one time period, familiarity with high culture was all the rage, right? You needed to know about the opera, you needed to know about the symphony. Nowadays, people who are in upper middle class and high class don't necessarily go to those things, right? Still, there's people who do. But it's not as much a cut and dry thing that this is a marker of cultural class. And instead what researchers are seeing is that what we call cultural omnivorousness is more a marker of high status culture. Cultural omnivorous, just liking lots of different kinds of culture, liking a mixture of high culture and low culture, right? So high culture being the ballet and stuff, low culture being more popular forms of entertainment like films and monster truck rallies and baseball games. And so they figure out that actually this is what counts as cultural capital these days, knowing a lot of different kinds of things, being familiar with a variety of forms. And this can be helpful in two ways. One of those ways is that if you have a wide variety of cultural knowledge, it's more likely that you're going to actually find something you have in common with that person who's interviewing you, right? So if you know a lot of different things, your chances are just going to increase that you might happen to have something in common with somebody that you're talking to and trying to convince to hire you. It can also function as a resource just in itself, because some firms actually value cultural omnivorousness on its own, right? And so this study on advertising agencies came and looked at different creative agencies and how they made their hiring decisions. And it was a process quite different from what the other researchers saw in law firms and management consulting firms. In this case, they were like, we don't even care if people have a degree. If they're creative and can come in and do the creative work, that's what we care about. But when they would look for the cultural matches, because that cultural matching thing was still going on, they were still looking to see, are you like me? Are you like the other people in our firm? What they valued was a sense that the person was culturally omnivorous. And this idea of, I want them to be different, but I want them to be different like me, right? Yeah. And so this idea that, yeah, we're all unique, and we're all unique in the same way, in that we all have quirky interests and curiosity, and we're all going out and reading interesting things and being taken off on tangents and gathering this familiarity with all kinds of things in the world, right? And you can kind of see why that would particularly matter in a creative agency where they're trying to creatively put together all kinds of materials for different kinds of clients, different kinds of products, using different kinds of creative inspirations. So in this case, there's partly that aspect of if you know a lot of different kinds of culture, you'll be more likely to connect. But there's also the idea that just being culturally omnivorous can be a signal of cultural capital as well. So what I hope is painfully clear from this is that cultural capital and our focus on culture ends up perpetuating inequalities all over the place, right? So we have this, myth that is ingrained in society that if you just work hard enough and you just get, the best grades, then the jobs will appear and you will be successful. And as sociologists who spend a lot of our time thinking about inequality and studying inequality and trying to figure out why it happens and under what conditions and how we can change it, we're interested in this. And we see that, when you have people in positions of hiring who are, out to look for all the qualifications, but also the cultural fit, you're going to naturally end up disadvantaging some people, right? I was a first-generation college student, university student, and given that a lot of students at UTSC are in that position, I'm guessing that at least some of you in the room also were the first in your family to go to university. And that in itself brings with it, when you're entering university, it brings with it a lack of cultural capital that is useful in a university setting, right? Because you didn't grow up with parents who had been to university or siblings that could pass on their tips and, what's appropriate, how are you supposed to act, how are you supposed to behave, how do you get your professors to pay attention to you? These kinds of cultural skills that are different from the knowledge and the grades that get you in, right? And so we see this in education. There's been a ton of research on this in education, in how it perpetuates these inequalities. And scholars are now starting to delve into how this is working after education and how it's working when people are going out in the workforce to try to get jobs and are faced with these cultural mismatches at times, right? Some of this culture you pick up at school. Some of it you pick up at the excellent programs at AANCC when they're teaching you how to navigate workplace culture. or when they're teaching you how to navigate university culture when you first get here, right? Some of it you pick up on your own because you're hanging out with people, you're seeing professors and how they act. But it is a harder climb, hence the ladder, for those who grow up without exposure to the cultural kinds of things that are appreciated by the dominant class. And so this can end up increasing class inequality. Now, I don't say this to depress you, although it is depressing. I say it as a way of, bringing awareness to it. And an awareness to you that when you're going out on the job hunt, when you're going out into the workforce, you need to be attuned to cultural stuff, right? And it kills me that sometimes this means having to adopt cultures that aren't familiar, having to adopt cultures that are no more or less valid than the cultures that we came from. But because of the reality of the way our society is stratified, in order to make particular strides, we have to do it, right? We have to figure out how we can fit in culturally, how we can make those matches in the employment sector. And you can do this by being familiar with a wide variety of cultural stuff, right? So instead of just focusing on reading and going to stuff that you're naturally interested in, broaden your horizons a little bit, be familiar with what else is out there, be familiar with what other kinds of interests people have. Do your research on the firms that you're interested in and the professions that you're interested in. Get a sense of, we're in this age where you can get information on anybody on the internet, right? So go stalk them on Facebook. Go stalk them on LinkedIn. Do searches and find PR announcements. Figure out what kind of organizations are these workplaces sponsoring when they're doing pro bono work. Figure out, if you can, from Facebook stalking, what kind of interests the partners have or the hiring people have. And it's not about being fake, right? Because people will see through that. They're going to see through it if you walk in and pretend that you're an avid rock climber and really, your preferred mode of activity on the weekend is watching Netflix marathons. So it's not about faking, but it is about familiarity, right? If you have the deep interest and you connect with the person on the deep interest, that's great, and that's, can be really helpful. But even just having a familiarity is helpful, so you find out someone is interested in a particular cultural pursuit, and you can signal that, oh yeah, I've heard of that, right? Or, oh, I read an interesting article about that, or, I went to a show that was like that a couple weeks ago. And again, just having this omnivorousness helps you in terms of maximizing likelihood you'll make connections, and in some cases being a quality in and of itself that really appeals to hiring people, right? And they want to see that you're involved and aware of a lot of different things. And you need to be aware, right? So when you're in an environment, you need to be scanning it and figuring out, okay, what are the unwritten cultural rules that people are doing that I may not know? And then how can I imitate that? How can I fake it till I make it? And this culture may be upper class, upper middle class culture. More generally, it may be culture specific to a firm, right? Or to a particular kind of occupation, right? But figuring out what are those cultural things and how can I mimic them and how can I try to absorb them? But the more optimistic point of this is that once you are in those positions, I urge you to try to make change. And when you end up being on the hiring committee, I urge you to look at the resumes that come in and to think about, well, why do I think this resume is better than this one? And is it because this person really likes volleyball and I play volleyball, and I think that's going to make them fit in better? Or are there reasons that that our company needs to have everybody be exactly the same, right? Perhaps we would be better if we had people who had different interests, if we had different cultures. And it's an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle because culture is unconscious for most of us, right? When we're not actively trying to concertedly cultivate a new cultural repertoire, a new batch of tools that we can put in our cultural toolkit, we just wander around immersed in culture all the time and we're not thinking about it. And so when you're in a hiring situation and you're on the side of the table that's choosing the new employee, You may be operating with unconscious bias. You may be operating with an unconscious desire to have people who are just like you. And you need to be challenging yourself to move beyond that and challenging your coworkers when you get into a situation where you have enough power, enough status to do that, to challenge them to think about how you do hiring in your organizations and in your firms so that we can maximize equity, right? So it's not just that everyone has the opportunity to apply for the job, but everyone actually has the opportunity to get the job, right? Because if you don't have the cultural match, you're probably not going to get it, even though you're allowed to apply for it. So this is what I leave you with, right? Culture matters. Culture distinguishes us. Culture maintains stratification. Culture can make it either easier or harder to get your foot in the door to your first job or your second job. And within these organizations, we're going to see repeated patterns of stratification and inequality. But once you get there, now that you know this, you have some information and I hope some responsibility to try and change those kinds of corporate cultures, to try to change those kinds of organizational cultures, and think to yourself about expanding the definition of what it means to have a good cultural match, and that a good cultural match doesn't always have to mean we're all the same. Okay, thank you.